Would you risk everything to save a life, even when your own world is falling apart? Could you face the horrifying truth hidden behind an act of cruelty? On a freezing morning, a truck driver spots something strange on an empty road. A mother dog struggling against death, with 4 helpless puppies by her side. What if you decided to stop, to change their fate? One choice, and nothing will ever be the same again. For continuing the story, tell me which city you are watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. No more waiting, the story begins right now. It was a bitterly cold winter morning, the kind where the frost bites through even the thickest coat. The road was empty, shrouded in mist, and silence pressed heavy against the snow-covered earth. Imagine driving through that stillness when something catches your eye, a faint silhouette on the sorting of the road. A mother deer, trembling against the icy wind, shielding her 4 fragile puppies, abandoned, alone, and barely clinging to life. Would you stop or would you keep driving, telling yourself it's not your problem? For Tom Miller, a lonely trucker in his red Peterbilt, this choice seemed simple until his late wife's words echoed through his mind. Sometimes angels appear in places you least expect. But what if this angel led him to something far darker? The fog was thick that morning, thicker than Tom Miller had seen in months. It hung in heavy sheets, swallowing the headlights of his red Peterbilt truck as it hummed steadily down Interstate 80. The world outside felt still, wrapped in a ghostly shroud of cold silence. Tom adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, his calloused fingers tightening out of habit. The cab was warm, but even so he shivered slightly. Maybe it was the weather, maybe it was something else. It was always in these quiet hours that he felt the weight of loneliness the most. His wife Emily had loved mornings like these. God's hour, she'd called them, when the world was quiet and waiting for miracles. Tom didn't believe in miracles anymore. The clock on the dashboard blinked, 6:14 a.m. He had a delivery to make in Portland, and he was already on a tight schedule. He'd learned long ago that the road didn't wait for anyone. Life didn't wait for anyone either. And then he saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, something barely there on the edge of the road. Tom squinted, leaning forward, but the fog made it impossible to see clearly. Trash, probably. He'd seen plenty of that before. Torn bags, broken furniture, sometimes even deer carcasses. You drove long enough, nothing surprised you. Not my problem, he muttered, shaking his head. But as his truck rumbled closer, his headlights caught it. A pale, trembling shape. It wasn't trash. It wasn't a deer. Tom's heart kicked up a beat. He eased his foot off the dam. The truck groaning softly as it slowed. The silhouette took shape. A dog. A living dog. Tom's jaw clenched. Damn it, he muttered under his breath. His hands hovered over the steering wheel. A bushing on the side of the road wasn't his problem. He had deadlines to meet. The trucking company didn't care about excuses. He could already hear his boss's voice in his head. You're late again, Miller. Clock doesn't stop ticking just because you want to play hero. The truck rolled past. Tom glanced in the side mirror, a streak of guilt hitting him like a slap. The dog was curled in the snow, so still it looked almost lifeless. Something small and fragile moved beside her. No, multiple somethings. Puppies. He swore under his breath and gripped the wheel tighter. Keep driving, Tom, he muttered. It's not your problem. But the thought wouldn't leave him. Emily's voice, soft and familiar, rose in his memory. Sometimes angels appear in the most unexpected places. He groaned, the sound echoing in the empty cab. His eyes flicked back to the road. He had a choice to make. Keep moving, meet his deadline, and pretend he'd never seen anything. Or stop. Stop and risk falling behind. Risk everything for a stray dog and her pups. His stomach twisted. What are you doing, Tom? He said aloud, as if arguing with himself. It's not like you can save them all. But he knew himself well enough to know that if he left, he'd see them in his mind for the rest of the day. No, for the rest of his life. He'd see those trembling shapes in the snow every time he closed his eyes. The truck hissed as he slammed the brakes. God damn it, Tom muttered. He put the truck in neutral, grabbed the flashlight from the glove compartment, and threw open the door. The cold hit him like a wall, sharp and biting against his skin. Snow crunched under his boots as he stepped onto the shoulder of the road. The flashlight beam cut through the fog, casting a pale glow on the frozen ground. "Hello?" he called out, his voice swallowed by the silence. No answer, only the soft whistle of the wind and the faint hum of the truck's engine behind him. He swept the beam of light across the snow, and then he saw her. The dog lay curled up, half buried in a drift of snow. Her fur, a once beautiful golden coat, was dirty and damp, matted with frost. Her head lifted weakly, her deep brown eyes locking onto Tom's. In those eyes, he saw everything: fear, exhaustion, and something else: hope. "Jesus," Tom whispered. Huddled around her were 4 puppies, their tiny golden bodies shivering violently in the cold. They looked barely alive. One of them let out a soft whimper, a sound so weak it barely reached his ears. Tom knelt down, his knees sinking into the snow. The cold bit through his jeans, but he didn't care. "It's all right, girl," he said, softly, holding out a hand. "I'm not gonna hurt you." The mother dog didn't move. Her breathing was shallow, her body trembling, as if every last ounce of her energy had been spent keeping her pups alive. Tom's throat tightened. "You're not going to make it out here," he murmured. "None of you will." For a moment, he froze again. What the hell was he supposed to do? He couldn't just load a stray dog and 4 puppies into his truck. The cab was no place for animals. And even if he did, what then? He wasn't a vet. He wasn't a hero. But Emily's voice came back, soft and persistent. "Sometimes angels appear in the most unexpected places." Tom exhaled sharply, the decision made. "All right," he muttered, "come on." He shrugged off his heavy coat and spread it on the snow. Carefully, he picked up the first puppy, a tiny, shivering thing that barely filled his hands, and placed it gently on the coat. The mother let out a weak, protesting whine, but Tom met her eyes. "I know, girl," he said softly. "I know you don't trust me yet, but I'm not leaving you." He gathered the other puppies one by one, wrapping them in the coat to keep them warm. Finally, he turned to the mother dog. She was watching him, her breathing labored but steady. "Come on, girl," Tom said, patting his leg. She hesitated. "Please," he whispered. "I can't do this without you." As if she understood, the dog staggered to her feet. She swayed slightly but managed to follow him as he led the way back to the truck. Snow fell softly around them, landing in her fur like a blanket of frost. Tom opened the passenger door and lifted the puppies up first, placing the coat carefully on the seat. Then he turned to the mother. "Up you go," he said, grunting slightly as he lifted her into the cab. She was lighter than he'd expected, far too thin. Once inside, the dog curled up around her pups, her body trembling, less now that the cab's heater blasted warm air. Tom climbed back into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut against the cold. He turned to look at her. Her eyes were half closed, but she was watching him still. "You need a name," Tom murmured, reaching for the gear shift. He thought for a moment, and then he smiled faintly. "Bella. I'll call you Bella." The dog blinked slowly, and Tom swore her eyes softened. As the truck rumbled back to life and rolled forward, Tom felt something shift inside him. He was late, he was off schedule, but for the first time in years, he didn't care. "Sometimes angels appear in the most unexpected places," he said softly, as the road stretched ahead and the fog began to lift. The small gas station sat on the edge of nowhere, its faded pine tree station signs swaying in the wind. The building was old, with peeling paint and a cracked window that had been scheduled for repair for as long as anyone could remember. It was a place forgotten by most travelers, except for those like Tom Miller, who knew the quiet stops best. Tom's red Peterbilt truck rumbled to a halt beside the lone pump, its engine coughing into silence. Inside the car, Bella lay curled up protectively around her 4 trembling puppies, still wrapped in Tom's heavy coat. The heat blasting from the vents had warmed them, but Bella's eyes remained wary, flicking to Tom with every sound. Tom sat for a moment staring through the windshield as the early morning fog lifted to reveal the familiar gas station. A sharp knock at the window startled him. "Tom Miller, what the hell's this now?" It was Jessica Parker, the station attendant, bundled up in a faded green coat and scarf. Her short chestnut hair peeked out from under a knit hat, and her green eyes were bright with curiosity. She'd known Tom for years back when he and Emily would stop by during long hauls. Tom rolled down the window and sighed. "Morning, Sarah." Her eyes narrowed at the bundle on the passenger seat. "What have you picked up this time?" "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," Tom muttered, climbing down from the truck. The cold slapped him again, but it was nothing compared to the icy scene from earlier. He opened the door to the cab and carefully lifted Bella out first. She was light, too light, and she flinched slightly, though exhaustion kept her from resisting. Sarah's face softened instantly. "Oh my God, is that a dog? She looks half dead." "She's not alone," Tom said, turning back to retrieve the puppies. One by one, he placed the small, trembling bodies into Sarah's waiting arms. Her expression darkened as she cradled them, her breath catching. "Where did you find them?" "On the side of I-80, Tom replied gruffly, trying not to show the tightness in his chest. "In the snow." "You did the right thing bringing them here," Jessica said softly. "I don't know about that," Tom muttered, rubbing a hand over his beard. "They're half frozen and I don't have a clue what I'm supposed to do with them." "Let's get them inside," Jessica turned toward the station's door. "David's here. He'll know what to do." Inside, the warmth of the gas station was a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. The building smelled faintly of coffee and motor oil, familiar and comforting in a way only small-town places could be. David Brown, the station's resident mechanic, was hunched over a counter covered in tools when they entered. He was a burly man in his early 50s with grease-stained hands and a permanent scowl that didn't match the kind heart beneath. "What's this?" David grumbled, straightening up as Jessica carefully set the puppies down on a blanket. "Tom found them in the snow," Jessica explained. "Their mother, too." David's gaze softened as he took in the scene. Jesus, poor things. He knelt down beside the puppies, inspecting each one with hands that were surprisingly gentle for their size. Bella lay nearby, her tired eyes never leaving her babies. "She's skin and bones," David muttered, running his hand over Bella's fur. "How long do you think she's been out there?" "Too long," Tom said. He crossed his arms and leaned against the wall, watching. Something gnawed at him, something he couldn't quite place. It was Jessica who noticed it first. "Wait a second." She crouched beside Bella, brushing back the fur on her neck. "What's this?" "What?" Tom straightened. "There's something on her collar." Jessica held up the worn leather band, pointing to a small, faded mark near the buckle. It looked like a logo, something circular, with what might have once been letters inside. Time and grime had nearly erased it. David squinted at the mark. "Looks like someone owned her." "That's not a stray's collar." "Does it mean something?" Tom asked. "I don't know," Jessica said slowly. "But," she hesitated, glancing at the puppies and then at Bella. "You're not going to like this, Tom." "What?" "This isn't the first time. Last week, someone found 2 golden retrievers abandoned near the old bridge south of here. Same breed, same condition, starving and weak. And there was another a week before that, near Route 22. Tom's brow furrowed. "You're saying someone's dumping these dogs?" Jessica nodded grimly. "Looks that way." David muttered a curse under his breath, his hands balling into fists. "People like that ought to be locked up." "Yeah, well, something doesn't sit right about it," Jessica said. She reached out and gently stroked Bella's head, who blinked at her tiredly. "This isn't random. Something's going on." Tom opened his mouth to reply when the faint rumble of an engine outside made them all freeze. Jessica turned her head sharply toward the window. "Did you hear that?" Tom pushed away from the wall and stepped closer to the glass. Outside, through the thinning fog, he saw a sleek black car idling near the gas pumps. Its dark windows reflected the gray morning light, making it impossible to see inside. The car sat there for a long moment, as though watching them. "Who the hell is that?" David muttered, his scowl deepening. The car lingered for a few more seconds before suddenly accelerating, its tires crunching against the gravel as it sped off down the road. Tom's stomach twisted uneasily. "You know them?" Jessica shook her head. "Never seen that car before?" "Yeah, but it's not the first time I've seen one like it," David said, his voice low. "There's been a black car hanging around near the shop a couple times this week. Thought it was some lost traveler, but now I'm not so sure." Tom looked back at Bella and the puppies. They were still curled up on the blanket, oblivious to the tension in the room. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," David said darkly, "that someone doesn't want folks paying attention to those dogs." A heavy silence settled over the room. Outside, the fog had almost cleared, but the air felt heavier somehow, as though it carried a warning. Tom looked at Bella again, her eyes half closed but still protective of her little ones. He thought of Emily's voice in his mind, soft but insistent. Sometimes angels appear in the most unexpected places. He wasn't sure if this was about angels anymore, but something told him he was already too deep to turn back now. The red Peterbilt truck came to a halt in front of Anderson Veterinary Clinic, its engine groaning before falling silent. Tom Miller climbed out, his breath a mist in the frigid air. He'd driven faster than he had in years, his focus sharp, his heart heavy with dread. Inside the cab, Bella stirred, lifting her head weakly as if she could sense her smallest pup's dire condition. Tom scooped up the puppies, still bundled in his coat, and led Bella carefully into the clinic. The building's green-painted door swung open with a chime, and the warmth inside wrapped around him like a reprieve from the merciless cold. "Dr. Anderson," Tom called, his voice rough. From a side room, an older man emerged, white-haired and thin-framed, but steady in presence. Dr. James Anderson had been the town's vet for as long as Tom could remember. His sharp blue eyes fell on the bundle in Tom's arms, and in an instant his demeanor shifted. "What's going on?" Anderson's voice was calm but urgent. "Found them on the highway," Tom said, kneeling to set the puppies down gently on a soft examination table. "The mother's barely holding on, but it's the little one I'm worried about." Dr. Anderson pulled on his gloves, taking no time for pleasantries. He knelt beside the smallest puppy, whose golden fur was barely rising and falling with each shallow breath. His eyes narrowed. "This one's critical," Anderson muttered, adjusting the puppy's position. "Let's see what we're dealing with." Tom stood back, his fists clenching and unclenching as the vet examined each puppy in turn. Bella lay nearby, watching with wide-eyed and worried eyes as if she understood that the life of her pup hung in the balance. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Dr. Anderson moved quickly but carefully, listening to heartbeats, feeling joints, and checking gums for signs of circulation. His frown deepened as he reached the smallest puppy. The vet gently pressed a stethoscope to the tiny ribcage and listened intently. "He's severely hypothermic, dehydrated, and weak," Anderson finally said, standing upright. His heart rate's slow and his lungs sound like they're struggling. "It's early pneumonia, probably from exposure to the cold. He's going to need fluids, antibiotics, and a warming protocol immediately." Tom swallowed hard. "Will he make it?" Anderson hesitated before answering. "I won't sugarcoat it. He's hanging by a thread. If we get him on a warming mat, start IV fluids, and administer oxygen, he has a chance. But we'll need to monitor him overnight, and treatment will need to be aggressive." Tom rubbed the back of his neck, his mind spinning. "And the cartons?" Anderson glanced at him, his tone apologetic but firm. "Stabilizing him alone will run around $800 to $1,000. If he needs oxygen support, longer or further antibiotics, it'll go higher. For the full treatment, you're looking at $1,500 minimum." Tom froze, staring down at the tiny puppy, the smallest of Bella's litter. His breath hitched. He didn't have $1,500. Trucking kept the bills paid, but there was never much left over. His savings were just enough for emergencies, truck repairs, hospital bills if something went wrong. But what was this if not an emergency? He remembered that conversation weeks ago at the diner. The two men in the booth behind him whispering about faulty stock and getting rid of what doesn't sell. He hadn't thought anything of it at the time, but now the words clawed at his mind. This puppy, Ben, Tom had already decided his name was Ben, had been left to die like trash because he was weak, because someone decided he wasn't right. Tom's jaw tightened, his chest burning with anger and helplessness. Emily's voice echoed in his mind. Sometimes angels appear in the most unexpected places. He took a deep breath, reached into his back pocket, and pulled out his worn leather wallet. Inside was the emergency fund he'd spent months saving. Without hesitation, he handed over a crumpled stack of bills to Dr. Anderson. "Do whatever it takes," Tom said firmly, his voice low but steady. Dr. Anderson studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. "I'll get started right away." The next few hours were a blur. Dr. Anderson worked tirelessly in the back room. He set Charlie on a heated veterinary warming mat to raise his core temperature gradually. Hypothermia could be deadly if treated too quickly. A small catheter was inserted into Ben's leg, allowing warmed IV fluids to drip slowly into his tiny body, rehydrating his weakened system. Oxygen flowed gently through a mask placed over his nose to help his fragile lungs. Tom sat in the waiting room, his boot tapping against the floor in restless rhythm. Bella lay at his feet, her head resting on her paws, her tired eyes following every sound coming from the exam room. "He's fighting," Anderson said quietly when he returned, pulling off his gloves. "We've stabilized him for now. The next 24 hours are critical. If he makes it through the night, his odds get better." Tom nodded stiffly, his throat too tight to speak. He looked down at Bella. "Hear that, girl? He's a fighter." Bella lifted her head slightly, her eyes meeting his. It was a silent moment of understanding, a promise that they wouldn't give up. Tom stayed at the clinic late into the night. He dozed off in the waiting room chair once or twice, but each time he woke with a start, the same image flashing in his mind. The black car, the frost-covered puppies, and that helpless little figure lying still in the snow. At one point, Anderson brought out a thermos of coffee and sat across from Tom. "You don't see a lot of truck drivers stop for animals," the vet said softly. Tom shrugged. "Didn't think I'd stop either," he hesitated, looking into the dark swirl of his coffee. "But someone left them out there, like they were nothing." Dr. Anderson nodded slowly. "You'd be surprised how often it happens. People trying to breed for money, puppy mills, illegal experiments, you name it. And when something doesn't turn out how they want..." He trailed off. "Well, you saw it yourself." Tom stared out the window, his thoughts heavy. "It's disgusting." Anderson paused, his expression thoughtful. "You know, it's people like you that give these animals a chance." Tom didn't answer. He just sipped his coffee and looked down at Bella, who had drifted into a fitful sleep at his feet. As dawn broke over the clinic, Dr. Anderson appeared in the waiting room with a tired but hopeful smile. "He made it through the night," the vet said. "He's not out of the woods yet, but he's a fighter. I've started him on a round of antibiotics to treat the pneumonia, and the fluids have helped. We'll keep monitoring him, but I think he's got a shot." Relief hit Tom like a wave, and he sank back into the chair, his breath shaky. "Thank you, Doc." Anderson gave a small smile. "You're welcome. But if he pulls through, it's because of you." Tom looked down at Bella, then toward the back room where little Charlie was fighting for his life. "No," he murmured, "it's because of him." Emily's words echoed one last time in his mind. Sometimes angels appear in the most unexpected places. Tom smiled faintly. Maybe she'd been right all along. The morning sun did little to warm the chill hanging over Maple Grove Station. Outside, frost clung stubbornly to the ground, sparkling under the weak light. Inside the small gas station, the hum of an old heater filled the room as Tom Miller sat hunched at a corner table, nursing his third cup of coffee. His red Peterbilt truck was parked out front, steam rising from its hood like a quiet warning in the icy air. Bella lay curled at Tom's feet, her golden fur clean but thin, her body finally able to rest. The three healthier puppies, swaddled in old blankets, huddled in a box nearby, their small chests rising and falling with rhythmic breaths. Only the smallest one, Ben, was missing. He was still at Dr. Anderson's clinic, fighting for his life. Tom's mind raced as he stared at the swirling, black coffee in his mug. He couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was unfolding. Something far worse than a family of dogs left to die. He remembered those men in the diner again, their casual mention of faulty goods, and his gut twisted. Across the counter, Jessica Parker's voice broke the silence. She was on the phone, speaking quickly but quietly. "No, I'm sure of it, Janet. Golden retrievers, young ones too. The collar's got a mark on it. Faded, but it's there. Yeah, I'll send a picture. You think it's them?" Tom glanced up, his eyes narrowing. Jessica hung up the phone with a sigh, her short chestnut hair falling slightly out of place as she pushed the strands back. She grabbed a notebook and walked over to where Tom sat. "What was that about?" he asked, though he had a sinking suspicion he already knew. Sarah's face was pale with concern as she sat across from him. "I called Janet. She works with Lighthouse Rescue Group. They deal with abandoned and abused animals across the county." When I described Bella and the puppies, she asked me to check for identification. That mark on Bella's collar, Janet thinks it's linked to a breeding facility called Silverline Labs. Silverline? David Brown, the burly mechanic who had just entered, frowned as he pulled off his gloves. I've heard that name before. Yeah, well, there's a reason for that, Jessica said, flipping through her notes. Silverline was shut down last year. The authorities raided their facility after reports of unethical breeding practices. Genetic experiments mostly. But when they got there, a lot of the dogs were already gone. Janet says it's like they vanished into thin air. Nobody's been able to figure out what happened to them. Tom sat up straighter, his brow furrowing. What do you mean, genetic experiments? Apparently they were breeding dogs with altered genetics, trying to create some perfect line, Jessica said bitterly. The ones that didn't turn out right, they just got rid of them. Tom's stomach turned, his mind flashing back to Bella and her pups huddled in the snow. You're saying Bella and her litter came from that place? Jessica nodded grimly. It fits. The collar mark, the condition they were in, and their golden retrievers. Janet thinks Silverline never really shut down. She says these underground networks don't just disappear. They go quiet for a while, then start up again somewhere else. The heater kicked on again, rattling softly in the corner, but the room felt colder now. David sank into a nearby chair, shaking his head. So what? They dump the ones that don't come out right? Like trash? Sarah's voice dropped. Looks that way. And if Janet's right, Bella isn't the first dog they've dumped nearby. Tom rubbed his face, frustration boiling in his chest. Those bastards. Before Jessica could reply, a low rumble outside drew everyone's attention. Tom turned his head sharply toward the window. A sleek black car had pulled into the gas station lot. Its windows tinted so dark they reflected nothing but the pale morning light. The car sat there idling, its engine a quiet hum. Who's that? David muttered, his voice low. Tom didn't answer. His eyes stayed locked on the car, his instincts screaming that something wasn't right. He stood, the legs of his chair scraping loudly against the floor, and stepped closer to the window. The black car lingered for another moment, just long enough for Tom to feel the weight of being watched, before it suddenly reversed, tires crunching on the frosty gravel, and sped off down the road, disappearing into the fog. They were watching us, Jessica said, her voice shaking slightly. Tom's jaw clenched. They've been watching me, David frowned. You're sure about that? Tom turned back to face them. That's the same car I saw yesterday. On the highway. It's not a coincidence. David's face hardened. Well, that seals it. Someone's trying to keep this quiet. Tom exhaled sharply, his mind racing. We need answers. If they dumped Bella and the puppies, maybe they left something else behind. What do you mean? Jessica asked. I mean, Tom said, grabbing his coat. I'm going back to where I found them. David, you're coming with me. The roadside was eerily quiet when Tom parked the truck in the exact spot where he'd found Bella. Snow had fallen again overnight, softening the ground, but the faint signs of disturbed snow were still visible. Tom climbed out of the truck, his breath fogging the freezing air. David followed, pulling his coat tighter against the wind. The sun was higher now, though it did little to cut the chill or the sense of unease hanging over the empty stretch of highway. You really think there's something here? David asked as they stepped onto the shoulder. There's gotta be, Tom muttered, his eyes scanning the snow. They didn't just leave her there by accident. For several minutes, the two men searched, their boots crunching against the icy ground. David kicked at a patch of snow, uncovering nothing but dirt and rocks. I don't know, Tom. Feels like a dead end. Tom didn't answer. He was focused on an area closer to the tree line, where the snow seemed more uneven. Kneeling, he brushed back the surface with his gloved hand. Something hard and metallic caught the light. David, Tom called out, his voice sharp. David hurried over as Tom pulled the object free. It was small and rectangular, a metal tag tarnished by the elements. Turning it over, Tom's stomach dropped when he read the words, stamped faintly across the surface. Property of GP Labs, David cursed. Silverline. Tom stared at the tag, anger rising in his chest like a slow fire. This proves it. Bella came from there. They dumped her. Dumped all of them. David scowled. And someone's still watching. That black car, whoever's in it, they don't want this getting out. Tom pocketed the tag, his jaw tight. Well, it's too late for that. He stood, looking back at the highway. I'm not letting them get away with this. David nodded slowly, his expression grim. So what now? Tom glanced toward his truck where Bella waited in the cab. The cold wind howled through the empty stretch of road, carrying with it the weight of unfinished business. Now, Tom said, his voice hard, we find out who's behind this and we stop them. The two men walked back to the truck, their boots leaving tracks in the snow. Behind them, the roadside stretched silent and empty, hiding secrets buried just beneath the surface. The engine of Tom's red Peterbilt truck hummed steadily as it barreled down the empty stretch of road. Snow had started falling again, a quiet dusting that turned the highway into a slippery, silver ribbon. David sat stiffly in the passenger seat, his arms crossed over his chest, watching the snowflakes blur past the windshield. You think that tag's enough? David asked, his voice cutting through the low growl of the engine. Tom glanced at him briefly, his jaw set in stone. It's a start. The metal tag label, property of GP Labs, sat securely in Tom's jacket pocket. It wasn't much, but it was evidence, proof that Bella and her puppies had come from Golden Paws Labs. The weight of the tag pressed against him like a reminder that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. David shifted uncomfortably. You really think the cops will take this seriously? They'd better, Tom muttered, tightening his grip on the steering wheel. Someone needs to. The two men drove in silence, the sound of the heater working overtime to fight off the cold. The plan was simple: get back to town and hand the tag over to the police. Let them take it from there. But simple plans never seem to stay simple. They were halfway back to town when it happened. Tom noticed the black car in his rearview mirror first. It started as a distant shadow against the snow-covered road, but the longer he watched, the closer it crept, its sleek body unmistakable. David, Tom said, his voice low. David turned his head. What is it? Look behind us. David twisted in his seat, his face hardening. Hell, it's them again, isn't it? Tom didn't answer. He kept his eyes on the road, his muscles tense as the black car closed the distance. The truck cab felt too small, the tension pressing in like a vice. The black car suddenly accelerated, its engine roaring as it pulled up alongside them. For a moment, Tom thought it would just pass by. Then the driver jerked the wheel, swerving dangerously close to the truck. What the hell? David shouted, grabbing the dashboard. Tom grunted, wrenching the wheel to keep the truck steady. The car swerved again, this time forcing Tom to slow down. They're trying to stop us, Tom said through gritted teeth. Yeah, well, they're doing a damn good job, David growled. The road narrowed ahead, a line of bare trees on either side. Tom eased his foot off the gas, the truck slowing to a crawl as the black car cut in front of them, skidding to a halt. The driver's door opened and a man stepped out. Tom's stomach turned. The man was tall, dressed in a black overcoat with dark sunglasses perched on his nose despite the low light. He looked clean-cut, too clean, and carried himself with the deliberate confidence of someone used to being obeyed. He stopped a few feet in front of the truck, standing still in the falling snow, his hands stuffed casually in his pockets. What do we do? David asked, his voice tight. Tom stared at the man for a long moment before he sighed and killed the engine. We see what he wants. You sure that's a good idea? No. Tom climbed out of the truck, the cold slapping him hard as he stepped onto the icy road. David followed reluctantly, his hands balled into fists. The man in the black coat smiled faintly as Tom approached. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that sent shivers down your spine. Mr. Miller, is it? The man said, his voice smooth and practiced, like he'd rehearsed this conversation 1,000 times. Tom didn't respond. He stood tall, his face hard. The man tilted his head slightly as if studying him. I hear you've been busy, sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. Tom's fist tightened at his sides. You dump dogs in the snow and expect nobody to care. The man's smile didn't waver. You've got a big heart, Mr. Miller, but big hearts can cause big problems. For you. What do you want? Tom demanded. The man's sunglasses reflected Tom's face as he spoke, his tone turning colder. I want you to forget about what you found. Forget the dune. Forget the Terrien. Forget Silverline. Tom's heart pounded, but his voice stayed steady. Not gonna happen. The man's smile faded. That would be unfortunate. He took a step closer, his coat flapping in the wind. For you, and for your friends. David stepped forward, his voice sharp. Is that a threat? The man didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a business card, holding it out to Tom. Think carefully, the man said. Sometimes it's better to let things lie. Tom stared at the card for a moment before snatching it from the man's hand. The man gave him one final smile, cold and empty, before turning back toward the black car. He climbed inside, and the vehicle pulled away, tires skidding on the icy road before disappearing into the trees. Tom looked down at the card in his hand. It was blank, except for a phone number printed in black ink. David exhaled sharply, his breath misting in the cold. Who the hell was that? Trouble, Tom muttered, crumpling the card in his fist. By the time they reached the police station in town, the sun was dipping behind the gray clouds, casting long shadows over the snow-covered streets. The station was small, with only a few squad cars parked outside. Inside, the air smelled of stale coffee and old wood, and the hum of a space heater buzzed faintly in the background. Detective James was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 50s, with thinning gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He sat across from Tom and David in a small, windowless room, the metal tag resting on the table between them. Silverline Labs, James murmured, reading the faint inscription. He looked up at Tom. Where did you find this? By the roadside, Tom replied. Near where I found the mother dog and her puppies. James leaned back in his chair, his expression darkening. We've been hearing whispers about Silverline for months. Illegal breeding, genetic tampering, nasty stuff. But we haven't been able to pin anything on them. They're careful. Real careful. Well, they're not careful enough, Tom said. Bella and her pups came from that place, and someone doesn't want us digging deeper. A man in a black car intercepted us on the road, told me to back off. James's brow furrowed. You get a name? Tom shook his head. No, just a card with a number. He handed it over. James took it, inspecting it with a grimace. This just got a lot bigger. He stood, slipping the card and tag into an evidence bag. We'll start the investigation immediately, and I'll warn you now. If Silverline is still active, they won't go down quietly. You might want to watch your back. Tom met his gaze, unflinching. I'm not backing down. James nodded. Good, because this tag might just blow the lid off the whole thing. As Tom and David left the station, snow began falling again, light and steady. Tom shoved his hands into his pockets as they walked back to the truck, his mind heavy with everything that had happened. They won't stop, will they? David asked quietly. No, Tom replied, looking up at the gray sky, but neither will we. Bella sat waiting in the cab, her eyes calm but watchful, as though she understood that something bigger was happening. Tom opened the door and climbed inside, his resolve hardening like the ice on the road. Whoever was behind Silverline, they'd picked the wrong man to threaten. The morning was colder than ever, but something had shifted. For the first time in weeks, Tom Miller felt like the weight on his chest had begun to lift. Outside Dr. Anderson's clinic, the sun peeked faintly through the clouds, its soft glow painting the snow-covered street in pale gold. Tom stood beside his red Peterbilt truck, his calloused hands jammed deep into his coat pockets. Bella sat next to him, her golden fur clean and soft once again. She looked stronger now, though her eyes remained watchful, always scanning for her puppies. The smallest one, Ben, was still inside. The night before had been touch and go. Pneumonia in a pup that young was no small battle, but somehow Charlie had pulled through. Dr. Anderson called him a miracle, but Tom knew it was more than that. Sometimes angels appear in the most unexpected places. Emily's words echoed in his mind again as he turned to the clinic's door, which swung open with a faint creak. Dr. Anderson emerged, his white coat dusted with fur. In his arms, wrapped snugly in a soft towel, was Ben. Tom's heart kicked at the sight of the little pup, his golden fur brighter than before, and his breathing stronger, if still shallow. Ben's tiny head turned towards Tom as though recognizing him, and for a moment Tom forgot the cold biting at his face. He's going to be fine, Dr. Anderson said, his voice warm but tired. He's still got a ways to go, but he's a fighter, like his mom. Tom stepped forward, his rough hands gentler than they'd ever been, as he took Charlie into his arms. Thanks, Doc. You saved him. Dr. Anderson shook his head. You saved him, Tom. You and Bella. Tom looked down at Ben, who let out a soft, contented sigh as he nestled into the warmth of Tom's coat. Behind him, Bella wagged her tail faintly, her eyes soft with trust. For the first time, she didn't look afraid. It wasn't until late afternoon that the news broke. At Pine Tree Station, the old radio behind the counter crackled with a special report. Jessica Parker stood frozen, one hand gripping her coffee cup as the broadcaster's voice filled the small room. Breaking news. Police have raided an illegal breeding and research facility operating under the name Silverline. Investigators uncovered evidence of inhumane genetic experiments on animals, primarily dogs, which were being discarded if they failed to meet specific criteria. Several arrests have been made, and authorities are confident this operation is part of a much larger network. David Brown let out a low whistle as he leaned against the counter, grease still smudged on his hands. Well, I'll be damned. They actually did it. Sarah's eyes were wide, her voice barely above a whisper. They shut them down. Outside, the familiar rumble of Tom's truck echoed through the lot as he pulled up. When he stepped inside, the small bell above the door jingled and all eyes turned toward him. In his arms, wrapped securely in a blanket, Charlie poked his tiny head out, letting out a faint, squeaky bark. Jessica smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. He made it. Yeah, Tom said softly, glancing down at the pup. He made it. David grunted, his face breaking into a rare smile. Tough little guy, just like his owner. Tom gave a small shake of his head, but he couldn't stop the smile tugging at his lips. I'm not his owner. I'm just someone who didn't look the other way. Maybe, Jessica said, but it's because of you that this is over. Those people are going to pay for what they did. Tom's expression darkened slightly. He thought of the black car, the man in the coat, the threats. He'd been warned to stop digging, but he hadn't. He couldn't. This isn't about me, Tom said finally, looking down at Bella, who was sitting patiently at his feet. It's about them. They deserve a second chance. That evening, Tom stood in front of his small, single-story home at the edge of town. The snow-covered yard looked emptier than ever as he opened the door, carrying Charlie in one arm, while Bella followed close behind, her 3 other pups waddling clumsily after her. Inside, the house felt too quiet, too still. For years, this place had been empty. No voices, no life, just the distant echo of Emily's laughter that still lingered in his mind. But as Bella curled up by the fireplace with her puppies tucked around her, Tom realized the silence wasn't so heavy anymore. He gently set Charlie down beside his siblings, where he nestled into the warmth of his family. Tom watched for a long moment, his chest tight. You've got a home now, he murmured, more to himself than to them. Bella lifted her head, her deep brown eyes meeting his. There was no fear in them now, only gratitude. Tom stepped back and sank into his old recliner, the springs groaning beneath his weight. He looked at the worn photo of Emily on the mantel and smiled faintly. You were right, he said softly. Sometimes angels appear in the most unexpected places. The days that followed were brighter. News of the Silverline raid spread quickly, and Tom's role in exposing the operation became a quiet topic of admiration around town. People stopped him on the street to thank him, though he never took credit for it. He said it was the ones who'd saved themselves. Charlie grew stronger with each passing day. Though he remained smaller than his siblings, he was feisty and determined, chasing his brothers and sisters across Tom's living room as though the cold days in the snow had never happened. David stopped by regularly, often with an armful of supplies. Dog food, blankets, and toys he claimed he just happened to have lying around. Jessica brought over treats and fresh-baked pizza, fussing over Bella and her pups like they were her own. And Tom, for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, Tom stood on the porch, a steaming mug of coffee in his hands. Bella sat beside him, her gaze fixed on the yard where her pups tumbled over each other in a clumsy game of tag. You did good, girl, Tom said, reaching down to scratch behind her ears. You kept them safe, and they're going to be all right. Bella let out a soft huff as if agreeing with him. Tom smiled as he watched Charlie pounce on one of his siblings, his tiny tail wagging furiously. That little pup had been on the brink of death, but now he was alive, truly alive. Emily's words echoed once more in his mind. This time not as a memory, but as a truth he could finally believe. Sometimes angels appear in the most unexpected places. Tom took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs, and for the first time in years, he felt like he'd finally found his way home. The seasons had shifted, trading icy winds for the gentle warmth of spring. Tom Miller's house, once a place of silence and shadows, now overflowed with life. The front yard, once an empty expanse of snow, was alive with the sounds of barking puppies and the laughter of visitors. Bella lay lazily on the porch, her golden fur shining under the sun's golden rays. Her pups, now sturdy, playful bundles of energy, chased one another across the grass, tumbling and yipping with joyful abandon. Even Ben, the smallest of the litter, ran at the front of the pack, his little legs stronger than ever. Tom sat in his old rocking chair, a mug of coffee in hand, and a faint smile on his face. The creak of the chair blended with the sounds of his new family. He watched Charlie leap clumsily onto his bigger brother, his tiny tail wagging with all the might his small frame could manage. David leaned against the porch railing, shaking his head with a laugh. "You know, I never pegged you as the dog dad type, Tom." Tom snorted softly. "Yeah, well, neither did I." Nearby, Jessica knelt on the grass, tossing a toy for the puppies. Her short chestnut hair was caught in the breeze, and her voice rang out with the kind of joy Tom hadn't heard in years. "They're growing so fast, you're going to have a full house for a while, Tom." Tom glanced at the house behind him, once quiet and empty, now filled with life. Toys were scattered across the living room, a dog bed sat in the corner, and the faint smell of puppy kibble lingered in the air. But it didn't bother him. It felt right. It felt like home. He took a sip of his coffee and let his gaze drift to the sky, clear and blue, with only a few wisps of white clouds. For the first time since Emily passed, he felt her presence, warm and constant. Her words echoed softly in his mind. Sometimes angels appear in the most unexpected places. Tom exhaled deeply, his smile growing. The sun dipped lower on the horizon as the day stretched lazily toward evening. Jessica and David lingered, sharing stories and laughing while the puppies, finally tired, curled up at Bella's side on the porch. Charlie nestled close to her, his small body rising and falling in peaceful sleep. "You ever think," David asked, breaking the quiet, "that all of this happened for a reason?" Tom glanced at him, his brow furrowing slightly. David shrugged, his rough voice softer than usual. "I mean, you could have kept driving that day. Most people would have, but you stopped. Maybe someone, something, wanted you to." Tom didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out over the yard, his heart full in a way it hadn't been for years. "Emily used to say God puts angels in our path when we least expect them," Tom said finally. "I used to think she was just being poetic. But now," he gestured toward Bella and her puppies, "now I think she was right." Jessica smiled, her eyes glistening slightly. "Maybe this was always meant to happen, Tom. Maybe this family was waiting for you." Tom's voice was quiet but firm. "I think we were waiting for each other." That night, as the house settled into a peaceful quiet, Tom sat on the porch alone. The puppies were curled up in their beds, and Bella lay on the rug beside them, her ears twitching in her sleep. The air was cool, filled with the faint hum of crickets and the rustle of leaves. Tom leaned back in his chair, looking up at the darkened sky filled with stars. His thoughts drifted to Emily, to her voice, to the memory of her laughter that once filled this house. "I hope you're smiling," he murmured softly, as though speaking to her through the heavens. "You were right all along." A faint breeze whispered past him, carrying with it a feeling of peace, of blessing. He thought of all the moments where he could have walked away, could have chosen the easy path, but didn't, because life had taught him something important. Sometimes the hardest decisions were the ones that mattered most, and sometimes angels really did appear in the most unexpected places. Tom clasped his hands together, bowing his head for a brief, quiet prayer of gratitude. He wasn't one to pray often, but tonight he did. "Thank you for guiding me, for showing me this path, and for bringing them home." When he opened his eyes, the house behind him glowed faintly with warmth, the light spilling from the windows like a promise. It wasn't empty anymore. As he rocked gently in his chair, a soft smile spread across his face. The story of Bella and her puppies wasn't just about saving lives. It was about hope, redemption, and faith. It was a reminder that even in our darkest moments, light can appear if we're willing to see it. Tom had once been a man who thought his life was over, a man who believed his best days were behind him. But Bella, Ben, and the other puppies proved that life always has more to give if we keep our hearts open. The story of the mother dog and her 4 puppies is a testament to compassion and brave decisions in the most critical moments. Sometimes these fleeting moments don't just change the fate of a small creature. They can change the course of our own lives. Can we live with our conscience when we witness suffering? Or will we turn away and continue down our path? Every decision we make in life carries immense responsibility, and this story serves as a powerful reminder to rise when we see the need. If this story has touched your heart and you believe that stories like these deserve to be shared, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next inspiring video. Hit the subscribe button and the notification bell to be part of a community of love, people who are always ready to open their hearts and help the small lives around them. Thank you for joining us on this journey, and remember, every kind act has the power to change the world in a miraculous way.